All right, well, welcome everyone to our Zoom meeting tonight. My name is Mike Lucan. I'm the Executive Director of Placer County Transportation Planning Agency, and tonight we're going to be discussing regional transportation challenges and needs. And tonight focused on the Granite Bay area, but we do have a lot of folks that come from different parts of the county to these meetings, because you can attend in your community or you can attend in another community. So sometimes we get a little bit of a cross section. So tonight we're going to try to make tonight as interactive as possible, and our apologies in advance that we have to do this in this wonderful Zoom environment, which I'm sure you are all very tired of doing. If you're like me, we seem to be doing Zoom all hours of the day these days, but it's we're still under the state's order, and hopefully here, in the next month or so, we'll be able to move about a little more freely, and we'll be able to have some of these community meetings in person. But tonight, in order to participate, we're going to try to make this as interactive as we can. And the way we're going to do that is, in order to participate, you're all muted right now, but in order to ask a question or participate, what you would do is use the chat function of Zoom. And if you're not familiar with that, there's a button typically at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And if it's not visible right now, if you go into the three dots or the more button, depending on your device, it should be located in there. And just all you would do is ask your question in chat. And then when we get to the end of each subsection of the presentation tonight, we will stop and answer your questions. And then at the end of the meeting tonight, the last section of it, we're going to be having kind of an open question and answer where you can make comments and the like. And then the very end, the good part, if you will, we're actually going to raffle off a gift certificate from Dominic's Market and Deli in our effort to help our restaurants, which are still recovering from the pandemic. So before we get going here, we have your county supervisor, Suzanne Jones, who would like to say a couple words of introduction before we get going tonight. So I'll turn it over to you, Supervisor Jones.
Thanks, Mike. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Suzanne Jones. Many of you already know me, but I am your newest supervisor for District 4. I want to thank you all for joining us today to talk about this, or to learn about this very important topic of transportation infrastructure. I'm sure you are all aware how traffic has been coming back in a very large and quick fashion. All the roads are congested once again. And so that's her whole purpose of being here tonight, is to discuss some ideas on our transportation infrastructure, and also to tell you about some of the projects that PCTPA has been working on. Some of the key projects in the Granite Bay area are future improvements to Auburn Folsom Road, Eureka Road, Laird, Barton, and Cabot Stallman Road, as well as future phases of the Dry Creek Trail projects that will connect Granite Bay to Roseville, and of course others. But this part of the process is extremely important. This is where we want to solicit ideas from the community. We want to get your feedback, and it's critical and crucial to our moving forward. And hopefully we will all come up with some great and wonderful ideas on what and how we move forward from here. And I want to thank you, Mike, for doing this presentation to my community. I'm sure that everyone is happy to hear from us about transportation. Thank you, Mike. Take it away.
Well, thank you, Supervisor Jones. And yes, we're going to talk about a number of topics tonight. On our agenda tonight, we're going to talk about traffic, which is not a great topic to discuss because it really adversely affects all of our lives. As we get to our appointments, or try to get to work, or try to get to take our kids to a swim meet or some other function. It really affects every part of our lives. But you all anecdotally know that traffic is back, but Kathleen Hanley on our staff is going to talk about and quantify some of that traffic, so you can see exactly where we're at and where we're going in terms of traffic. We're then going to talk about kind of a a topic related to traffic that not a lot of people understand, but we think it's very important, especially here in Placer County. We're going to discuss impact fees, and those are things that go to pay for traffic improvements here in Granite Bay and throughout the county, and the role of builders in the economy. They mitigate the impact of their developments, and rightly so. But it's a very important part of how we fund transportation projects here in Placer and throughout the state of California. And then we're going to go probably into probably the most important part of tonight. As Supervisor Jones indicated, we have a number of regional projects that we're focusing on, and as well as projects right here in Granite Bay. And we want to hear from you. We are transportation planners that base a lot of what we do upon methods of assessing traffic impact, but that doesn't really always reflect what you as the community think is important. And so although a lot of these projects don't change over time, we want to get your input in terms of how we prioritize them, because as we move forward, we want to make sure that we're putting our dollars that you as taxpayers contribute. We want to make sure we put those in the right places. And then the last part of tonight, as I indicated earlier, is kind of a Q&A section as well as the raffle. So tonight, who's going to be presenting to you is myself. Again, I'm the Executive Director of PCTPA, and then Kathleen Hanley, who is an Associate Transportation Planner for our agency. So before we kind of get going here, we have our next topic, which is, let's see. Pop up there, kind of who we are. And so a little bit about PCTPA. Normally we kind of, people scratch their head and go, who is this crazy agency? They have the county in their name? Are they the county? Or are they the cities? Well, we're actually neither. We're actually a special district made up of the cities in the county. So we have a board of directors, which is representative of all of our jurisdictions here in the county. So one member from each of the cities or the towns, 2 members from our board of supervisors. Actually, Supervisor Jones is on our board of directors, and then 1 public member. And in the case of this year, our public member is from the Lake Tahoe area. So that board of directors basically decides transportation policy and funding here in Placer County. And we work with the cities. Each of the cities does their own land use planning. So we don't determine, whether a grocery store can go on a corner or where the housing is. The cities or the county tell us that, and as well as where their roads are going to go. And then our job is to regionally look at how all this fits together, to do a traffic model, if you will, for the whole county, to plan for transportation in a long range transportation plan, and then to go out and essentially get those dollars for transportation funding throughout the county and help the jurisdictions get those dollars. So we were, and why do we even exist? So PCTPA, and I'll use that as an abbreviation for our very long name, the Placer County Transportation Planning Agency. We were created about 30 years ago, and we and El Dorado County created separate transportation planning agencies. Instead of us being part of the regional transportation agency, which is called SACOG, our 2 counties decided we wanted to determine our own future. So it's a bit of local control. And that way we decide as a county where we want to put our transportation dollars, where we want to place our roads, what priorities we want to place on different aspects of transportation, instead of having somebody in Davis or Winters or Woodland or some other location in the Sacramento Valley tell us what our transportation priorities should be. And this worked very well for us. We built some pretty major projects, and we also get to determine the scope of these projects and how these projects are implemented. And so we're one of the few transportation planning agencies in the state that can say, and we'll knock on wood here, that we have delivered every single project that we've implemented on time and on budget, or ahead of time or under budget. And not a lot of transportation agencies can do that. But a lot of that is because we control the projects. We control what the priorities are. We control how these things are implemented, and we don't let them happen to chance, and make sure that they are good for our community. So the last slide, our next slide here, a lot of people say, well, sure, you're planning for Placer County, but transportation, especially in roads and highways and rail systems, they're all over the place, and you have to work. Don't you work with your neighboring jurisdictions? And the answer to that is yes. We do plan for Placer County, and Placer County is our top priority. But we actually start out in what's called the Northern California mega region, which is an economic region in Northern California, which extends all the way from the Bay Area all the way up to Reno and Lake Tahoe. And we first start at that mega regional level. We then focus on the Sacramento metropolitan area. That's that organization, SACOG, or the Sacramento Area Council of Governments. We plan then at the regional level, and then we plan down at the local level here in Placer County. And as you can see, this illustration of this slide is why we do that, because a lot of people in Placer County commute to other places or travel to other places. 82,000 people travel from Placer County to Sacramento County prior to the pandemic each day for their jobs. And so we have to account for things like that and plan for things like that, typically 20 to 40 years out into the future. So Kathleen's going to kind of quantify that and give us a little bit of data on where we are at with traffic here in Placer County. Go ahead, Kathleen.
Thanks, Mike. So as Mike mentioned, and as you all acutely guessed on the polling, traffic is certainly back. And while it's nice to see for an economic development reason, for our quality of life, it has a significant impact on all of us, and particularly the residents of Granite Bay. So I'm going to take a look at and walk you all through a number of data sources to talk about what traffic being back really looks like. So this first slide looks at vehicle miles traveled per resident. And so this comes from cell phone GPS data. So as you can see, with time being on the x-axis, starting in March 2020, Placer County residents traveled about 18 miles a day per person on average. With the first stay-at-home order, that dropped to about 12 VMT, and then has oscillated, gone up and down over the course, opening and closure and changing rules over the different times, but has remained, just a little under 15. And then with the final closures over the holiday period, we saw our most significant drop, with about half as many miles traveled per person since before the pandemic. However, since January and the start of the new year, we've seen a really significant climb, and now we're at about 15 miles traveled per day per person, which is 20% down since March 2020. So on a miles traveled per person basis, not quite to where we were, but if we look at our highway facilities, that definitely starts to tell the story about the traffic that we're all seeing out there on the roads. So first, we're going to take a look at Highway 65. Highway 65, this is looking at hourly traffic volumes. So this data comes from Caltrans, State of California, traffic counters that are on our highway facilities. So we've got over the different times of day, and then the different colors, the years. So as you can see in the AM peak, 2021, where we're at now in blue, is still down pretty significantly from 2019 and even 2020. We don't have those really early morning long distance commuters hitting Highway 65 quite so early in the morning, but once we get to the real true peak around 8 a.m., 2021 is right up there with 2020 and almost back up to 2019. And then more importantly, that afternoon peak that all of us see, particularly on southbound 65, is surpassing the previous 2 years. So all of those afternoon trips that folks are taking for other purposes, not necessarily commute, as the economy recovers, so certainly does our traffic. And then if we take a look at northbound, a similar story with the AM peak not quite reaching the previous 2 years levels, but the 2021 afternoon surpassing 2019 and even rivaling 2020. And of course, as many of you know, with the phase 1 improvements to the 8065 interchange, much of that traffic on northbound has been pushed farther north up on 65. So that high number in 2020 is a result of that difference in infrastructure. If we look at speeds with the reduced in traffic volume, traditionally we see an increase in speeds, and that's certainly true here in 2021. You can see throughout the day that blue line above the previous 2 years, folks are traveling at a faster speed at nearly all times of day. from a flow perspective, that's nice to see folks are efficiently getting where they want to go. But of course, we want to remind everyone to travel safely and to especially slow for the cone zone as we get back, and we still see some of those lighter volumes on our highway facilities. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at Interstate 80. Looking at Interstate 80, the 2021 traffic volumes, total number of vehicles on the road, is still down. It hasn't rebounded quite as fast as Highway 65. With all the growing communities, the density around 65, that just traffic came back a lot more quickly than it did on Interstate 80. But certainly we're approaching in the middle of the day, we're right there. And at both of the peak periods, the PM more so than the AM. In the eastbound direction, we're certainly approaching back our 2020 and even our 2019 numbers. And then in the westbound direction, and this is taken right where that congestion is between 65 Interchange and Riverside Avenue as you're heading westbound into Sacramento, where all that traffic stops, especially in the afternoon peak. 2021 is right back up with the previous 2 years, and still having the same phenomena with the commuters not quite returning to travel in the morning. And then when we take a look at hourly traffic speeds, a similar story to on 65, although maybe not quite the same variance during the times of day. But as you can see with the lower traffic volumes, we still have those high speeds slightly above what they were in the previous 2 years all around the facilities. And you're not getting those significant dips in the two peak periods that you would have seen. Folks are generally traveling at around the same speeds all the times of day.
We also have a fancy thing called a travel demand model or traffic model that we use to analyze traffic and to come up with what improvements are needed. And we're in the process of updating that right now. And so Kathleen is going to tell us a little bit about both our model and our impact fee system. So take it away, Kathleen.
Thanks, Mike. So I want to start by noting that, of course, big transportation infrastructure projects take on a number of funding sources, but I'm going to focus on building impact fees and the traffic demand models that determine those fees, since those seem to be one of the more confusing funding sources that come with transportation projects. Here in South Placer, including in the Granite Bay area, we have a regional impact fee authority called the South Placer Regional Transportation Authority. I'll refer to it as SPARTA here today. And so what SPARTA does is using traffic impact fees and travel demand models determine what is the regional benefits that the building community should contribute to construct regional projects. So cities and the county have their own traffic impact fees for their local communities on the local, the same way that they would have, sort of fees for schools and parks and rec and other sort of civic needs that the building community would contribute. SPARTA oversees how the building community contributes to regional projects that go between and connect our communities. So we'll start with talking about what is an impact fee. So an impact fee is a fee that's required of new development. So a new, typically residential in Placer County, but any type of new development gets built. And what the fee does is it accounts for the cost of that growth on public infrastructure. An important part to note is that what these fees do is if you break it, you need to pay the cost of fixing the infrastructure. So the new development that the building community is bringing online wrecks the effectiveness of a facility, then the fees would account for how much they wrecked it and how to fix it. But they can't pay for existing needs in our infrastructure. So if we already have facilities that are over capacity, the building community can't be held accountable because their additional development isn't affecting a system that already is above capacity. And all of these impact fees are extremely regulated by state and federal laws. And so they're fully set through and very, very detailed. So regional impact fees, the kind that SPARTA collects, pay for a number of improvements in the program of projects, and these are determined by the traffic demand model. So some of these have already gone to construction, like phase 1 of the 8065 interchange and the improvements at I-80, including those at Douglas Boulevard and Atlantic, and then some in the Lincoln Bypass, and then some are future. So widening Highway 65, widening Sierra College, and the construction of a regional facility that Mike will detail later in the regional project section called Placer Parkway. So the Mitigation Fee Act requires a number of things, and this is where I talk about the sort of detailed legal background for impact fees. And I'm not going to go into this in detail, but the short version is that what the Impact Fee Act requires is that we have a traffic demand model as an agency that identifies existing and future transportation deficiencies and calculates how much different developments contribute to future deficiencies in the transportation system. And then it's sort of like filing your taxes, in that there's a complex accounting framework wherein it's determined what the individual fees required are for each development. So when you look at these traffic demand models, they take into account a lot of things, sort of the same number of things that transportation planners have to take into account. So land use assumptions, looking at what the type of development is, as well as existing land use around it. Looking at travel patterns, trip lengths, and destinations, and how folks will travel, taking into account projections in terms of population growth and migration, and looking at how that might affect different behavior. And then also looking at the transportation options, the actual infrastructure, the type and width and amount of our roads and highways and commuter buses, rail, and including our bikeways and trails. So the traffic demand model is a graphic, mapped type model. So if you think about it sort of as an aerial here of South Placer, and then the traffic demand model takes into account existing land use as well as future uses, and not just generally, but also looks into account more specifically, like what are really anchor uses that might draw a lot of traffic versus more minor uses. And then lays on top of that our existing facilities in our highway and road network, and then additionally adds our trail system, both the on-street facilities like our bike lanes and our sidewalks, as well as our trail network that connects sort of behind our communities along our trails and natural assets. And then it also looks at improvements, lays on top of that, what would the existing improvements do in terms of determining how this whole model works together. So if we take a look at an example, so if you see on the left here, this is sort of the existing conditions that the traffic demand model would take into account. And let's say a new development coming to this area would require the construction of a new road across this facility. On the right, you can see the blue squares show where the new facility is being constructed. And then the colors of the other segments determine how the construction of this new facility affects these other facilities. So the green segments are facilities that would see less traffic as a result of the construction of this new facility, and the red are the ones that would see more traffic. So with the construction of this new facility, you could see how it would draw, the new road would draw more traffic sort of across it and on its connecting roads. So in determining the fair share that the development would have to pay, what we look at is the traffic levels, the existing here in gray, and what is the capacity of the facility, and then the future traffic that this development would add onto that. And then the fee is only responsible for the additional, not the existing traffic that's already on that facility. And impact fees pay for a number of projects, many of which I've showed a map previously, many of which we're going to talk about later today in Mike's details on the regional projects. But you can see that in the amount that they're responsible for, the SCARTA percentage here, depends on that amount that we were talking about in the orange on that bar chart, how much the development is increasing the need for that facility. And so that is reflected in how much is the responsibility of the fee. So you can see it varies on projects, with many of our largest projects being 100% paid for by development fees.
So if we can move on to the next slide. So if we take this 3 billion and we break it down a little bit, so 3 billion is what is needed in all of Placer County. And that's not only our regional roadways, but it also is our local roadways and other modes of transportation, such as transit and bicycle and pedestrian. So we need, for the next 40 years, according to our transportation plan, about $3 billion. And you know, although that is a big number, it's not an insurmountable number. And we again have this mechanism to pay for it, and that's essentially through development impact fees. And as Kathleen indicated, we can only charge what is allowed by law. We can only charge for their impact. And so that impact is about $2 billion worth of projects. And so we have about $1 billion of that remains unfunded, that we have to go out and find other sources of funding, mainly grants and state and federal funding, to help bridge that gap. So and that all, you know, worked pretty well up until recently. And so if you go to the next slide, what we had to do is essentially, especially with regional roadways, is the formula that was used in order to that we used to plan our community. So back when we did our general plans, we designed our community based upon a formula that has been in place since World War II. In the Truman administration, the Eisenhower administration, so shortly after World War II. And that formula was, and this is in place because the state and the federal government own most of our roadways, and we had to come up with 90%, or we had to come up with 10% of the funding for that, and they would pay for 90%, and it worked very, very well up until about 10 or 15 years ago. And the law still has a minimum amount that you have to come up with to fund a project, and it's roughly about 10%. Sometimes it's 20%, but we had the ability to fill that gap, if you will, that local funding, or pay for that with these development impact fees. But what happened is about 10 or 15 years ago, the state and the federal government said, hey, we are, this nation, this state, this region is growing so fast that we don't have enough money to go around, and they changed the formula, or they changed the rules on us. And that came in the form of competition. So yes, you can still, the minimum amount needed is 10%, but in order to actually get this money to compete for it, you now have to come up with essentially dollar for dollar. So if you put in $1, I'll put in $1. So half of it has to come from the state and federal government. 10% of it comes, you know, from local funding, but there's a gap, and that gap is there was a question asked of, you know, why did we get behind? It's because of this. We don't have the money to compete. And what's happened in other parts of the state, 25 other counties in California have decided to come up with a means by which to pay for that local funding. And that's in the form of either a transportation sales tax or a parcel tax or something like that. And so now for us as the county, we're actually the largest county in California that doesn't have a local funding mechanism. Every time we come up against, say, San Mateo County or Fresno County or Los Angeles County, we lose because they essentially put half the money on the table. We put our 10% or 20% in some cases, and we simply can't compete against that. And that is why we are now behind. And we've been trying to find that local source dating back to about 2013, and have been unsuccessful in doing that. Now, the next question everybody's going to ask is, well, wait a minute, didn't we just approve this thing called the gas tax? Wasn't that supposed to pay for all these transportation improvements? And unfortunately, the answer is no. The state took about 17 years to come up with a source of funding in the form of an increased gas tax, or its fancy name, the Road Repair and Accountability Act, or SB1. But what it did is it only funds what we have already. So which is important, and we should fix what we have first before we build new things. But the state was supposed to come up with a mechanism, as many, if not most other states in the United States have done, is come up with a mechanism to fund what you have, and then to help with what you need in the future, because our entire nation is growing by leaps and bounds. So yes, very important. You know, we generate about $20 million a year in Placer County with SB1, but it goes to pay for our potholes. It goes to pay for our roads. It goes to repair our bridges. It goes to replace our public transit buses that drive almost 1 million miles in their effective lifetime. It goes to pay for pedestrian safety, and a tiny amount goes for local congestion management, but that's in the most congested parts of our state, mainly around our seaports in LA, Long Beach, and Oakland, and none is left over for the rest of the state. And so things like our 8065 interchange, Highway 65 widening, Placer Parkway, it's prohibited to use this gas tax funding for that. So again, very important to maintain what we have, but our state decided that you as local agencies need to come up with funding to fund expansion of your communities. And so that is essentially SB1 in a nutshell. I wish I was here to say, it paid for everything, but it doesn't. We have about $1 billion in local roadway repairs needed in Placer County because it took the state of California 17 years to come up with this source of funding. And at $20 million a year, it's going to take a while for us to fix the roads and that backlog, if you will, of road repairs and replacing our transit buses and that type of thing. But we're working very hard. Our road maintenance programs in every one of our communities is going full bore to try to get these roads fixed. But it's a daunting task, as you know, and we wish we could fix all the roads right away. But at $20 million a year, it's there's a long ways to go to get to that $1 billion repair. So what I want to talk about next is our priorities, and this kind of is probably the most important part of the presentation tonight, and the one we want the most feedback. And you've already asked quite a few questions on it. But before we kind of get into those projects, we have a couple recent examples of projects where if we had the money, what could we do? And the first project here in the next slide has to do with bike and ped. And we got some questions actually before the meeting tonight from some of the participants that wanted to know how we could build more bike and pedestrian trails or sidewalks or in that type in our community here in Granite Bay. Well, we were able to going up to Auburn. Auburn's an old state highway, which when it was built didn't really have sidewalks and bike lanes and that type of thing on it in any connective fashion. And so we went and got what was a couple years ago the largest grant in the Sacramento region for sidewalks and pedestrian and bicycle facilities, and we are now filling those gaps. And the way we had a little bit of money, and we were able to essentially attract a very large investment by the state of California on Highway 49. Another example of a project is right down here in South Placer County. If we go to the next slide, we were able to actually fund a bunch of projects along Interstate 80. And so we funded a new transit line from Lincoln to the hospitals here in Roseville, and then on to the light rail station. We were able to fund an expansion of the Dry Creek Greenway, which I'll go into in a little bit, which is a great bike trail that goes someday all the way from Granite Bay through Roseville and out to Placer County, and eventually hooks into the American River Bike Trail system down in downtown Sacramento. We're able to fund the next phase of that. And then two really important projects, our last two bottlenecks on Interstate 80 are what we call the I-80 auxiliary lane projects. And the way we got the funding for that, and here is a slide that shows you those two bottlenecks, which are severe congestion along Interstate 80. The need for a lane, a fifth lane from Douglas Boulevard to Riverside in the westbound direction, and then in the eastbound direction, a lane between the 8065 interchange and Rockland Road, where prior to the pandemic, every day Sierra College was in session, you had a significant backlog of traffic from the interchange to Rockland Road. And so we got these projects funded along with $67 million worth of other projects, not only here in Placer County, but in Sacramento County. Well, how did we do that? Well, Sacramento County actually has a local sales tax measure for transportation. And so they overmatched our projects, and therefore we could come in with our 10 or 20% of our projects in terms of matching funds, and we're able to kind of ride on their coattails. Not something we're going to be able to do very often at all, but it shows you that with a little bit of local dollars, what you could achieve to pursue funding for our transportation needs. So with that as a backdrop, I'm going to talk again a little bit more about regional projects, and I'm going to take this from the kind of the macro level on our highways and freeways down to the local level here in Granite Bay. So in South Placer, we have kind of the big five projects. We have the widening of Highway 65. We have the Rockland, the 8065 interchange that we've mentioned a couple times. We have those auxiliary lanes. We just got funding for those, so that's good news. But then we have a couple other projects which you may know about. We're going to expand Baseline Road to 6 lanes all the way from Roseville all the way out to Highway 99. And then also build a new highway called Placer Parkway, which will not be a freeway, but it will be a limited access expressway. Functions essentially the same as a freeway, from the Whitney Ranch Parkway interchange between Lincoln and Roseville up on Highway 65 all the way over to Sankey Road interchange, where it connects to State Route 99. So those are our big projects, and I'll go through these in a little bit more detail. So the next project, again, everybody's heard of, and we actually were able to build the first phase of that, is our 8065 interchange. If we could go to the next slide. And what we were able to do in that phase 1 is kind of cobble together our last remaining dollars from leftover projects, from things like Sparta, which we mentioned earlier, our impact fee system, and about five or seven sources of funding for roadways, and build the first phase of what will be a $500 million project. So we built the first phase, which was $50 million, which was to expand a lane over the ravine, if you will, over the viaduct bridge, all the way up to Pleasant Grove Boulevard in Roseville. And we're also able to, in the next slide, you'll see we're also able to construct the final segment of the Stanford Ranch Galleria interchange. If you remember, when you were going from northbound 65 onto Stanford Ranch Road and you wanted to get to Costco, prior to our build out of this interchange, you had to get across 4 lanes of traffic, sometimes very unsafely, in order to get into Costco to do your shopping. Well, now we've built this out to full build out condition, which is expanding the off ramp and also adding signal lights and other traffic control devices to get people in and out of Rockland and Roseville safely. But we have a long ways to go on this interchange, and we have another $450 million in improvements to go. And I'll go through kind of the different parts of this interchange. So the first part is we have to reconfigure and widen the connectors to that. And how we're going to do that is we're going to replace what is now a cloverleaf off ramp from 80 onto 65. And we're going to replace that with 2 large bridge structures, flyovers, if you will, which will connect to that viaduct. If we go to the next slide, you'll see we will also widen and the connectors coming from Highway 65. And then the last part is we will solve, if you go to the next one, is we will solve what is called the weave. And so as you know, if you've used this interchange before, especially when you are driving by people who haven't used this interchange before, there's a real problem with people not knowing exactly where they go. And what that does is that leads to rear end collisions. And unfortunately, we've had about 13 rear end fatalities over the last 15 years on this interchange. And that's principally because of 2 things. One is people aren't sure exactly where they're going to want to go. But the other problem is the off ramps here that were constructed over 50, 60 years were as they were built too close to each other. So you have the Galleria, the 8065 interchange starting on the east, then you have the Taylor Road off ramp, and then you have the Eureka off ramp. And what we need to do is we actually need to eliminate one of these, but not eliminate the access. So we're going to actually eliminate the Taylor Road access point and take the access to Taylor off Eureka. So there will be a frontage road, if you will, that will be built to give you access onto Taylor, but fewer interchanges, if you will, to help with this weave situation, this rather unsafe situation. And then the last part of it in the next slide will widen the roadway underneath the interchange in order to meet design parameters and full build out potential of that interchange. And the next slide kind of shows you a little bit about what that would look like from an artist's rendering. Again, a flyover bridge, eliminating that clover leaf. And then what you see in the middle there is actually HOV lanes, which will be built on State Route 65, which will connect to the existing HOV lanes on Highway 80. So the next biggest project we have, and equally as important, is widening Highway 65. And so we have plans to widen Highway 65 all the way to Blue Oaks with 8 lanes, and then all the way to the city of Lincoln with 6 lanes. And we have the first phase of this project already designed, permitted, and ready to go. That would be the next worst traffic congestion in the region after we fix the what was at the time the worst with phase 1 of the 8065 interchange. This is the next worst, which everybody sees every day on 65, which is that congestion from Blue Oaks essentially down to Galleria. And so this would widen that section as the first phase of the project. And then over time, the next phases would be built and constructed again, 8 lanes to Blue Oaks and 6 lanes all the way to the city of Lincoln. Our next project that I mentioned in our top 5 is Baseline Road. Baseline Road is a very, very well utilized roadway, which up until recently was mostly 2 lanes in each direction and is an alternate to Interstate 80. And so for a long time, we have had planned to expand that roadway first to 4 lanes, and then when growth warrants to 6 lanes, all the way from Foothills Boulevard in the city of Roseville, all the way out to Highway 99. And we're beginning the first phases of this project, the preliminary design of this the 4-lane roadway all the way to Highway 99. And you can see from the artist rendition in the next slide, the profile of the roadway. 2 alternatives we're looking at. One is roadway only, and then the second one, which is probably what's going to occur, which is that 4-lane roadway, but also constructing a barrier separated bike trail. We have a lot of specific plans and growth planned in West Roseville and West Placer County, and also in Sutter County, and this would give a way for those specific plans to connect. And at the same time, it would probably make the roadway more acceptable to get state and federal funding by including alternative modes like bicycles. And then the last project that I'll mention, and one you may not have heard about, is Placer Parkway. And in the early 2000s, Placer County approved a new roadway because if you expanded Highway 65, expanded Interstate 80, if you expanded our local roadways to accommodate the maximum amount of vehicles with the growth planned in South Placer and regionally, it wasn't enough. And so we, again, about 20 years ago, designed Placer Parkway, which is like a freeway. It's a limited access expressway all the way from near Rockland on Highway 65, that half-finished interchange you see at Whitney Ranch Expressway or a Parkway, all the way over to Sankey Road in Sutter County. And we're actually nearing the final design of the first phase of that in the next slide, which is the completion of that interchange. And then moving the roadway in a westbound direction to Foothills Boulevard, where it would connect up to the city of Roseville. This roadway is actually about 98% funded by private development impact fees, as Kathleen explained in her presentation, because this is all generated by the need created by development. And so this roadway will be built in phases as development occurs. And so this first phase was built by Placer County in association with Thunder Valley Casino, or the United Auburn Indian Community, is building that first phase to accommodate growth right there at the intersection. But then as the next project comes online, which is Placer Ranch, then the next project that comes online is Amoroso Ranch. And then the next project is Regional University. It will be built by those developers in those phases. So this roadway will take quite a long time to build, but we are building, hopefully this first phase will start construction in 2023 and relieve some of the localized congestion between Rockland and the city of Roseville by giving another alternative route on Foothills Boulevard. So the next slide is local roadway projects. So we talked about these regional roadway projects, but you have to be able to get on the regional roadways, and a lot of our major thoroughfares are do not have facilities adequate to get people onto those roadways. And so projects like the widening of Blue Oaks in Roseville, or the Rockland Road Interchange. I mentioned we got the money for the expansion of the highway, but the Rockland Road Interchange is actually undersized and needs to be expanded. And a number of other projects, from the Horseshoe Bar Road Interchange to Ferrari Ranch Road and in Lincoln, and a number of other projects. We just cited some as examples here. So we have need for local roadway projects that connect to our roadways. But then we have a need for ways to get around our communities, and that's where we get down to Granite Bay. And so our next slide is a list of projects right here in Granite Bay, and this is a huge list, and I'm not going to go through every project on here, but these are projects that are in your Granite Bay community plan, and they have been then connected to this county's capital improvement plan for Granite Bay. And all of these projects, with maybe one exception, the Dry Creek Greenway, are financed through development impact fees. And as development impact fees are collected, when there's enough money in those pots for those development impact fees, then these projects are implemented. And so these are the projects that have not collected enough impact fees to be able to be funded, but are planned to be funded in the future. And you can see most of these are related to signalization. There's a lot of road widenings. There's some a lot of class 2 bike trails that have to be installed on these. And then there's some major projects on here. We had a question about Douglas Boulevard. And so Douglas Boulevard in the Granite Bay Community Plan, and I know some people don't like this, but it's designed to go to 6 lanes. And the reason it's designed to go to 6 lanes, kind of like Baseline Road, is it has to accommodate traffic that's going to go anyway between Roseville and Folsom, 2 major job centers, and as well as the retail development in both communities that is going to be transversing this road. So that needs to be expanded to 6 lanes, as well as doing other things like non-vehicular things like public transit and alternative modes, but it's a necessary improvement sometime in the future to build it to 6 lanes. The Dry Creek Greenway I mentioned, which I'll go into in a little bit, is a very important project to get people out of their vehicles and onto the bike trails instead of using their private vehicles. But again, just a number of projects. These are things I'm sure you've seen already as you've participated with the Granite Bay MAC and the Granite Bay Community Plan. These projects are right out of there, but very, very important to fund, to allow these roadways to function properly and to get people within Granite Bay and from other destinations through Granite Bay. So if we go to the next slide, so I've talked a lot about roads, and we are Placer County, and we're a suburban community, and roads are the #1 way we get people around, but there are other ways to do that. And so one of those ways is with and I'm going to kind of start again kind of at the local level and build to the regional level, but is our local bicycle and trails networks. We've never seen the type of use that we've seen with these than we have during the pandemic. Folks are out there using these for recreation and for exercise, but they're also viable commute routes. And so we're hoping, and this is as you see here, there's 3 different types of bike trails. There's Class 1 bike trails, which is off the road. There are Class 2 bike trails, which are barrier separated roadways. And then there are Class 3, which are bike lanes, which you see on many streets throughout the county. And what happens is we prepare a master plan for different areas of the county. In this case, the the Placer County is in the middle of updating their bicycle and trail and pedestrian plans, and working through that. And each part of the county has these facilities in the plan. And then once the plan is approved, then our job with the county is to go and help find money to fund these projects. And then as we go from the local level, we are also trying to connect our communities. So, well, actually, I'll talk about the Dry Creek Greenway first. So the Dry Creek Greenway actually is at the ultimate, regional level. We are trying to create regional trail systems, things that, many other metropolitan areas in the U.S. have, which our community has one of them, which is which I'm sure you're all familiar with, the American River Bike Trail that goes from Folsom Lake down to downtown Sacramento. But you may not know that with the Dry Creek Greenway, we're actually trying to do the same thing in the Placer County area, which is to take a bicycle trail all the way from Folsom Lake through Granite Bay, through the city of Roseville, out into Placer County, west of Roseville, and then hook up to other road bike trails in the northern Sacramento County area, which eventually connect into the American River Bike Trail down in downtown Sacramento. So what we're trying to do at a macro level in the region is try to create our own version of a very, very well utilized bike trail, the American River Bike Trail, trying to do that in Placer and Sacramento counties. We're also trying to connect our communities. If we go to the next slide, I think. Actually, the first part of that, I'm sorry, is here is a map of the Dry Creek Greenway showing where it goes, as well as the first part of that that just was recently completed right in downtown Roseville, the Downtown Rivers project. So if you've seen that project, that's the beginnings of that bike trail, which will then go in an eastbound direction towards Granite Bay, and then in a westbound direction out into Placer County. So very beautiful project here in downtown Roseville, and the start of the construction of that, which again will take many years to complete, but something that our community can be very proud of. And then as I kind of skipped ahead in the presentation, but the next part of this bicycle network is linking our communities right here in Placer County. If we go to the next slide, which is our regional bicycle network. So trying to connect Lincoln to Roseville, or to Rockland, and then to Roseville, to try to connect Auburn to Loomis to Rockland. We are trying to create these regional bicycle networks, again, for people to enjoy, but also for a potential commute alternative in addition to our roadway system. And then the last part, which we mentioned, is kind of a filling of our gaps in our system. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see that one of our main activities, we have a lot of bike trails in our communities if you look at those bicycle plans, but a lot of them are not connected. And that's why that happens, is because a lot of our bike trails are built by private development in one area, and then the next parcel doesn't develop, and then the next parcel beyond that develops, and our job is to try to go find state or federal funding to fill those gaps. And so we spend a lot of time trying to create these partially connected systems. And here's one part of Placer County where you can see we're trying to fill these gaps. So a lot of people or a lot of our time is completing these trails or these bicycle systems. And a lot of folks think, well, bike ped, that should be easier than roadways to construct. Well, actually, many times they are not, or they're as equally as difficult as roadways. We like to have our bike trails in our nicer areas of the county, sometimes in very pristine locations like along creeks. And the problem with putting them along creeks, they're very nice to ride along, but they have sometimes very costly improvements that need to be made to ensure that we don't have an impact on the environment. Or sometimes they go across private property, and we have to work with private property owners to ensure that their properties are not adversely impacted. And those sometimes take very significant amounts of time, costs, and ultimately cost of actually designing or filling those gaps. So we spend a tremendous amount of time here in Placer, and other communities do too, in filling those gaps. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is our public transit system, and kind of the last part of our presentation tonight. And public transit in a suburban community like Placer County is very difficult. We have 3 transit agencies in our county. If we go to the next slide, which are Roseville Transit, which is in the city of Roseville, Placer County Transit, which connects our communities, and then Auburn Transit, which serves the city of Auburn. And these 3 transit providers work very, very hard to try to create transit systems in our community and systems that people ride. And again, it's in a more densely urban situation, public transit, I wouldn't say is easy, but easier, because you have high density development, which generates enough people to ride transit, and it is very well utilized. But in Placer County, we have very long transit routes, which have 1 hour gaps in their service, because basically it's what we can afford. But the problem is it creates routes that people don't always like to utilize because it takes you a long time to get anywhere. So our next slide here has to do with commuter bus service. So this is one, our local service is very challenged because it takes a long time to get anywhere. But our commuter bus service, and we talked about this earlier, is very well ridden. We have these 14 trips every day to downtown Sacramento, the largest employer in our region, and these buses are full to the brim. You have to get on at the first stop if you want a seat. And if you don't, sometimes you have to stand all the way to downtown Sacramento. And we certainly have plans to expand these commuter buses as a very viable way to get to downtown Sacramento, where many people work. But again, we have to restore confidence in both our commuter systems and our local systems. The last part of our transit network is what we call our door-to-door services. And these are mostly for folks that don't have the means by which to utilize those fixed route systems, those regular bus routes. And so we have dial-a-ride systems in Roseville, Placer County, dial-a-ride, which also services Granite Bay. Auburn has their own variation of that called a deviated fixed route, which is their regular routes will actually deviate sometimes to get to people near their existing routes. We also have a program called My Rides, which just recently changed its name to Placer Rides, which is a service to help those in need to get to their medical appointments in different communities here in Placer County and also into Sacramento County, to where some of our major medical facilities are located as well. It's going to change now to Placer Rides, which is an all volunteer system. So essentially, if you know someone that doesn't have a means to get to their medical appointments, say at Kaiser Morse down in the Arden Way of Sacramento, this service could actually reimburse that person or a friend of that person for the cost of that ride down to that area. And then we have a thing which I'll talk about here in a second called Microtransit, which we're hopefully going to try in East Roseville and Granite Bay here in the near future as a different way to provide transit, again, to kind of get people to where they want to go quicker, so they use transit. So as I mentioned, the problem with transit nationwide is, and this graph is very similar to what's here in Placer County, is transit has been declining in ridership over the last 10 years significantly. A lot of this has to do with it's just easier to own and operate a car. You can now finance a car for almost 8 years for no money down, either a new or a used car. So it makes it very easy to achieve car ownership. But a part of this, and we can't do a whole lot about that, but what we can do is make transit more rider friendly, or get to people to where we want to go. Instead of these meandering routes in our communities, a more direct means to get people to where they want to go on public transit, especially here in the post-pandemic time. We have to convince people to use a service, and we have to improve that service. And the way that we are looking at, if we go to the next slide, is a new thing called microtransit. And what microtransit, so in the past, in the 70s, 80s, we created these large meandering bus routes that went throughout our community. And we tried to guess, well, we think people are going to live here and they're going to go here to the Social Security office or to the library or to the shopping center. And we created these giant loops, which take an hour to get to anywhere. And then if you miss the bus doesn't come again for another hour. And before you know it, it takes you 2 or 3 hours to get to where you want to go. And then to come back, it's the same situation. It's an hour to 3 hours to get back. And pretty soon it's going to take all day, to take a trip, which would normally take you 10 or 15 minutes in a car. So guess what? You're going to take a car. Well, and so our public transit systems, it's no secret that our local bus routes, for the most part, are empty most of the day because they aren't going to where people want to go in an efficient manner. And so microtransit is a variation on that. And many communities have tried this, and very many communities right here in the Sacramento region very successfully. And what it does is it's a cross between Super Shuttle, if you remember that service at the Sacramento airport, or a shared shuttle service, and Uber and Lyft. So instead of waiting on this meandering route, essentially you would use your smartphone, or you would call if you don't have a smartphone, and you would summon these smaller transit vehicles, anywhere from these cutaways, which we use for our dial-a-ride service, down to the bottom right, which is a service in West Sacramento, which usually utilizes vans, would pick you up from your home and take you and 6 of your friends to their location in 20 or 30 minutes. And then in order to come back, just like Uber and Lyft, you'd summon it with your smartphone and it would bring you back at a cost much less than Uber and Lyft, but in a much more efficient manner. And this has been done in Citrus Heights. They started out with 2 of these and expanded now to 10 of these vehicles in Citrus Heights. West Sacramento has many of these vehicles that go around their town. It's also being done in Rancho Cordova, in East Sacramento and downtown Sacramento, and in Placer County. When we look at new forms of transportation, we don't like to be on what we term the bleeding edge, and this is a technology that is now proven. But we're going to take a look at this in a pilot project. We're hoping this summer to release a request for proposals to initiate a microtransit pilot project, looking at some of our communities, such as Lincoln and Rockland and east part of Roseville, and potentially even Granite Bay, to see if this service is a viable means of getting people out of their single occupancy vehicles and utilizing this to get to where they want to go. And again, it is not any cheaper than those big transit buses that you see driving around our community. The difference is our hope is that people will utilize this, and those vehicles will be utilized instead of us paying for empty transit vehicles going throughout our community on a daily basis. So we're going to try this, and hopefully it's something that worked in other parts of Sacramento and throughout the US, but we're going to try it right here in Placer County, and hopefully it's a success. So the last thing I'm going to mention tonight is our intercity rail system, which is the last part of our public transit system. So we have in our midst here in Placer County the 3rd most successful intercity rail system in the entire United States, which goes from Auburn all the way down to the Bay Area, well, to Sacramento first, and then to the Bay Area, and then down to Silicon Valley. This service was growing by leaps and bounds prior to the pandemic. If you went in the morning to the Roseville station, the Rockland station, or even the Auburn station, you would see the park and ride lots at those facilities are full every single day. And so what that tells us is this is growing, and we want to grow this even further. And so our next slide here, and our last slide of the evening, is how we're going to expand that. And right now we have 1 train a day in each direction, very well utilized, but we would like to expand that to 3 daily round trips initially, and then eventually to 10 daily round trips of actual trains coming to Placer County. Now they can only come to Roseville, and there's a complicated discussion about that it's because the rail lines are owned by Union Pacific Railroad, and so we have to comply with their requirements for freight rail and passenger rail, and so they've permitted us to look at going to Roseville. Someday our hope is to go all the way up to Auburn and maybe beyond, but initially we're going to look at Roseville to expand to three trips a day, and then to 10 trips a day. And what this will do, it'll change it. Right now it's somewhat of a super commuter system to the Bay Area, and we have a bunch of people using it for that purpose, but not very many people use it to commute to Sacramento. And our hope is that by adding these daily round trips, it will actually become a commute alternative, and again, getting people out of their single occupancy vehicle and parking and riding the train to Sacramento and places beyond. So that's all we have for tonight. I did want to say it's not the end of the conversation tonight. If you think of something or you want to just discuss these topics more, you can call Kathleen, you can call me, you can email either one of us. You can certainly contact your supervisor, Supervisor Jones, or any one of the staff from the county public works or planning department, and we'd be happy to talk to you. So we're not people in big ivory towers that are doing things. We want to talk to you. We want to hear from you. And that's really the only way we can prioritize things and get things built that you want to happen. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Supervisor Jones to close us out tonight.
Okay, I just want to tell everyone, thank you so much for taking the time to come and listen to the presentation. I hope it was very informative. I know it was for me. And if you have any questions, like Mike said, you can either contact him at his office. Feel free to contact us at our office, either me, myself, Suzanne, or my district director, Michael Spellis. But hope you all have a nice evening and think over all these projects, and we'll touch on them again, I'm sure, over and over again. So
absolutely.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Mike, especially thank you for that.
You're welcome. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.
Yeah, everybody have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.